December 7, 1941, 7:42 a.m. The flight deck of carrier Akagi, 230 miles north of Oahu. Commander Minoru Genda watched the second wave of Japanese aircraft returning from their bombing runs. They came back in formation, throttles pulled back to conserve fuel, wings still carrying the smell of combat and burning oil. Smoke rose from distant targets across the island. The harbor below Pearl Harbor lay transformed. Battleships burning, ships listed at impossible angles, columns of black smoke rising thousands of feet into the morning sky. Genda was 37 years old. In the hierarchy of the Imperial Japanese Navy, he held the rank of commander, which was relatively junior for someone whose influence reached directly to Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. For the past 11 months, Genda had served as the principal aviation tactician for Operation Z, the designation given to this attack. He had designed the training schedules. He had determined attack formations. He had specified target priorities. He had calculated ordnance loads for every aircraft type. He had spent nearly a year solving the engineering problem of how to deliver 353 aircraft across 2,000 miles of ocean to strike an enemy naval base and return. The operation had succeeded tactically. That fact was undeniable. The numbers were staggering. 4 battleships destroyed outright. 4 more heavily damaged. 18 total ships sunk or crippled. Approximately 2,400 American personnel killed. Japanese losses of only 29 aircraft from 353 launched represented a loss rate barely exceeding 8%. By any measurement applied to combat operations, the attack had been devastatingly successful. But Genda was not celebrating. While officers around him embraced each other and shouted in triumph, Genda stood apart, watching the returning aircraft land on Akagi's heaving flight deck. His mind was processing different mathematics than the visible success suggested. Calculations about fuel consumption, equations about oil barrels, numbers about tanker capacity and submarine losses and industrial production rates. The mathematics told him something the celebration did not acknowledge. Japan had just won one of the most brilliant tactical victories in naval history, while simultaneously guaranteeing its own strategic defeat. The recognition had struck Genda during the operation itself. As the second wave prepared to launch, Genda had stood on the bridge reviewing the attack plan one final time. The target list was explicit. Battleships were priority 1. Cruisers and destroyers were priority 2. Shore facilities and support infrastructure were priority 3 if time permitted. Nowhere on the target list appeared the fuel storage tanks that supplied the American Pacific Fleet. Genda had immediately understood the omission's significance. 4.5 million barrels of fuel oil sat in above-ground storage tanks on the eastern side of Pearl Harbor Naval Base. 49 massive cylindrical tanks stood in 3 separate facilities. The lower tank farm, constructed between 1913 and 1923, held approximately 1.4 million barrels in 22 tanks. The middle facility contained roughly 500,000 barrels in 10 tanks. The upper tank farm, the largest, held about 2.5 million barrels in 17 enormous tanks, each with 150,000 barrel capacity. Together, these 3 facilities constituted the entire fuel supply for the American Pacific Fleet's forward operations. The tanks were constructed for peacetime efficiency, not wartime security. They sat above ground, clearly visible from the air, clustered together to minimize piping distances. They were optimized for economical operations, not survivability. The tanks were extraordinarily vulnerable. Their walls were thin steel plate designed to hold liquid under atmospheric pressure, nothing more. An armor-piercing bomb, even a smaller 500-pound bomb, would rupture a tank completely. The fuel inside would pour out and ignite. Fuel oil does not explode spectacularly like gasoline, but it burns intensely and persistently. A ruptured fuel tank would create a massive fire burning for days or even weeks. The heat from one burning tank would be intense enough to rupture adjacent tanks even without direct hits. Fire would spread from tank to tank across the entire facility. Once the first tank was breached and burning, the entire storage complex would be doomed. All 4.5 million barrels would be destroyed. Admiral Chester Nimitz would later make an observation that captured the magnitude of the oversight. Pearl Harbor contained 4.5 million barrels of fuel oil, and all of it was vulnerable to 50 caliber bullets, let alone bombs. The Japanese attack had focused exclusively on battleships, dramatic targets that looked strategically important, but were actually becoming obsolete as the nature of naval warfare evolved. The aircraft carriers, the submarines, the repair facilities, the dry docks, the truly critical targets were either absent that morning or deliberately ignored. But the fuel tanks represented something far more significant than battleships. The tanks represented sustained operations. They represented the ability to project power across thousands of miles of ocean. They represented logistical endurance. American planners understood this completely. When American military strategists analyzed naval operations, they calculated fuel consumption with the same attention that architects applied to building blueprints. Every destroyer steaming across the Pacific carried a finite quantity of fuel oil. Every cruiser launching aircraft burned fuel in quantities determined by throttle setting and distance traveled. Every battleship, despite its massive size, was ultimately dependent on tankers and shore-based storage. The fuel storage at Pearl Harbor was the Pacific Fleet's lifeline. Without it, American ships could not sustain extended operations thousands of miles from the continental United States. The storage represented months of accumulated supplies, reserves that had been painstakingly transported across the Pacific and stored against future needs. Genda understood all of this with clarity that went beyond the typical officer's knowledge. His expertise in aviation tactics had forced him to study logistics, the unglamorous mathematics of how many tons of supplies were required to keep combat operations running. He had calculated fuel consumption for aircraft operations. He had computed the range limitations that fuel created. He had designed the entire Pearl Harbor operation around fuel calculations. He knew that destroying the fuel storage would have consequences far exceeding the value of any battleship. It would have forced the American Pacific Fleet to withdraw from Hawaii and establish its main base in California, more than 2,000 miles away. It would have crippled American naval operations for months, possibly years. It would have given Japan strategic breathing room, time to consolidate conquests, develop defenses, prepare for American counteroffensives. But the Japanese aircraft never attacked the fuel tanks. Not one bomb fell on them. Not one torpedo was expended against the storage facilities. The second wave of aircraft returned to the carriers, with their ordnance still largely intact in the areas where fuel storage was located. The fuel tanks remained untouched, full, ready to serve their intended purpose. The omission was not accidental. The attack plan had been deliberately constructed to exclude fuel storage from the target list. Pilots had not been briefed on the importance of those facilities. No ordnance had been allocated specifically for their destruction. The decision-makers in Tokyo had determined that battleships were the proper targets. Big, dramatic vessels that looked strategically important. Vessels that provided psychological impact through their destruction. This was not stupidity. The Japanese Navy understood logistics. Japanese planners were competent, educated men who had studied military strategy and naval operations. The decision to ignore the fuel tanks reflected something deeper than tactical oversight. It reflected fundamental miscalculations about the nature of warfare, about how long wars lasted, about industrial capacity, about oil supplies, and about the ability of captured territories to sustain military operations. These miscalculations had been built into Japan's entire war plan. They had originated months earlier during the planning phase. They had been accepted without serious challenge because they reflected what Japan's leadership wanted to believe about the war. In September 1941, the Japanese Navy faced a critical mathematical problem. It required calculating whether Japan could sustain a war against the United States. The answer depended almost entirely on a single resource: petroleum oil. Japan imported 90% of its petroleum before the war. In peacetime, Japan consumed approximately 32 to 37 million barrels annually for all purposes, military and civilian combined. Most of that oil came from two sources: the United States and the Dutch East Indies. In July 1941, the American government had imposed a comprehensive oil embargo following Japanese occupation of southern French Indochina. Britain and the Dutch government in exile had immediately implemented their own embargoes. Virtually overnight, Japan had lost access to more than 80% of its oil supplies. By September 1941, Japan possessed approximately 50 million barrels in strategic reserves distributed between Navy stocks, Army stocks, and civilian reserves. But Japan's consumption rates were alarming. The Imperial Japanese Navy alone was consuming approximately 2,900 barrels per hour during routine peacetime operations. That calculated to approximately 69,600 barrels daily, or 25.4 million barrels annually, and that was just the Navy. Add Army consumption and civilian requirements, and Japan was burning through its entire 50 million barrel reserve at accelerating rates. The mathematics were straightforward and deeply troubling. Without new sources of oil, Japan would exhaust its reserves sometime in 1943. The nation faced a choice with only two apparent options. The first was capitulation, withdrawing from China, abandoning the entire Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, accepting American demands for reduced military capabilities. The second was war, seizing the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies before reserves ran out, acquiring new supplies through conquest rather than purchase. The Imperial Japanese Navy chose war, but that choice required answering a fundamental question. Could Japan win against the United States before running out of fuel? The answer that emerged from Japanese military planning was yes, but only under three critical conditions. Each condition seemed reasonable. Each was supported by historical precedent or military doctrine. Each proved catastrophically wrong. The first assumption that underpinned Japan's war strategy was straightforward: the war would be short. Japanese military planners believed the United States would negotiate a settlement after 6 to 8 months of fighting. Americans, according to this analysis, were accustomed to comfort and unwilling to accept heavy casualties. After initial defeats, they would agree to a compromise recognizing Japanese control of Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific. This assumption meant fuel consumption calculations only needed to account for a brief campaign. Long-term sustainability did not matter. The reserves Japan possessed would be sufficient if the war lasted only half a year to a year. The second assumption reflected classic Japanese naval doctrine. Operations would follow the decisive battle pattern that had defined strategy since the 1905 victory at Tsushima. The combined fleet would remain mostly in home waters, waiting for the American Pacific Fleet to steam westward. There would be one or two major fleet engagements, where Japanese forces would destroy the American fleet in climactic surface actions fought near Japan. This meant most Japanese ships would spend most of their time anchored in harbors or at bases, consuming minimal fuel. Only a small percentage of the fleet would be actively operating at any given time. Fuel consumption would be predictable, manageable, relatively low. The third assumption addressed the resource problem directly. Capturing the Dutch East Indies oil fields would solve Japan's supply problem permanently. The oil fields in Borneo, Sumatra, and Java produced 65 million barrels annually in 1940, before the Japanese invasion. Japanese planners estimated military fuel consumption at 35 to 40 million barrels annually. Capturing those fields would provide more than enough oil to meet Japan's needs indefinitely. The mathematics appeared sound. With 50 million barrels in reserve and the prospect of capturing 65 million barrels per year of production capacity, the numbers suggested Japan could sustain a war. Based on these three assumptions, Japanese planners concluded they could fight and win. The strategic planning documents from 1941 show no fundamental doubts about the feasibility of a Pacific War. The mathematical projections supported the operation. The calculations suggested victory was achievable. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was assigned the responsibility of designing the attack that would initiate this war. Yamamoto was 57 years old in 1941, relatively old for active command in the modern military, but still energetic and mentally sharp. He had traveled to the United States as a young officer and had studied American society. He had observed American industrial capacity firsthand. He had watched American oil production, American shipbuilding, American manufacturing capabilities that dwarfed anything Japan possessed. Yamamoto understood, in ways that many Japanese officers did not, the vast difference in industrial resources between Japan and the United States. On January 7, 1941, nearly a year before Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto wrote a letter to Navy Minister Koshiro Oikawa. In that letter, Yamamoto stated with stark clarity that Japan could not win a prolonged war against the United States. American industrial capacity was vastly greater than Japan's. American oil production was hundreds of times larger than Japanese domestic production. If the war lasted more than 6 to 8 months, Japan would face inevitable defeat, driven by simple industrial mathematics. Yamamoto wrote that the only possibility of success was a quick knockout blow that might shock the Americans into negotiating a settlement. But even that possibility was remote because Americans, based on historical precedent, did not surrender after initial defeats. They became more determined, not less. Defeat inspired American resolve, not capitulation. Yamamoto never believed Pearl Harbor would achieve a decisive strategic result. He knew the mathematics did not support a Japanese victory. But Yamamoto was trapped by institutional pressures that shaped all Japanese planning. He could express doubts in private letters. He could make pessimistic predictions in conversations with trusted colleagues. But he could not publicly refuse to plan the operation. That would have been viewed as insubordination, as disloyalty, as undermining national unity. His career would have been destroyed, and someone else would have been appointed to design the attack. So Yamamoto planned Pearl Harbor to the best of his ability, knowing it would probably fail strategically, hoping desperately that somehow the Americans would react differently than history suggested. Captain Kamito Kuroshima served as senior staff officer to Admiral Yamamoto. Kuroshima was recognized as one of the most intellectually brilliant officers in the entire Japanese Navy. He had an unusual reputation that reflected his unconventional approach to strategic thinking. In his cabin aboard ship, Kuroshima sometimes worked while completely naked, claiming that wearing clothes distracted him from complex calculations. He consumed vast quantities of rice and almost nothing else, fueling his body with minimal distraction from his mind. He could recite from memory the fuel capacity, cruising range, and consumption rates of every major warship in both the Japanese and American fleets. In early 1941, as Japanese naval planners faced the critical calculation of whether Japan could sustain war against the United States, Kuroshima was tasked with detailed logistical analysis. He possessed the mathematical sophistication to work through the fuel calculations with precision that most officers could not match. Kuroshima understood that the three assumptions underlying the war plan were optimistic, perhaps dangerously optimistic. The first problem was obvious to anyone who studied American history. Wars involving the United States had never been short. The American Civil War had lasted 4 years and consumed resources on a scale that shocked European observers. World War I had involved American forces for nearly 2 years of brutal attritional warfare. Americans, when they committed to war, typically committed until victory was achieved. The notion that Americans would negotiate a settlement after 6 months of fighting contradicted everything American military history suggested. The second problem reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of how modern naval warfare actually functioned. The decisive battle doctrine had worked in 1905 when battleships fought other battleships in predictable circumstances. But by 1941, naval warfare had transformed. Aircraft carriers projected power from distances where battleships could never see their targets. Submarines hunted prey across thousands of miles of ocean. Amphibious operations required escorts spanning entire task forces. Naval warfare in 1941 was not about waiting in home waters for one climactic engagement. It was about extended operations across vast distances, constant maneuvering, continuous fuel consumption at combat intensity rates. The third problem was the most critical. The assumption that captured oil fields would solve Japan's supply problems was demonstrably wrong. The mathematical error was built into the planning from the beginning. When Japanese forces swept through Borneo, Sumatra, and Java in early 1942, they found the oil infrastructure systematically sabotaged. Allied defenders, knowing they could not hold the territory, had deliberately destroyed production capacity before retreating or surrendering. At Balikpapan in Borneo, one of the richest oil-producing regions in Southeast Asia, Dutch engineers had demolished key facilities. They had used dynamite to destroy pumping stations. They had blown up storage tanks. They had set oil wells on fire, creating massive blazes that burned for weeks. They had dumped concrete down drill holes, rendering wells inoperable. They had removed critical components from refinery equipment and thrown them into rivers or buried them. They had sabotaged electrical systems and damaged pipelines. The sabotage was not complete enough to prevent Japanese forces from capturing some facilities relatively intact. But overall damage was substantial. Even facilities that appeared intact often had subtle damage, missing parts, damaged seals, compromised safety systems, equipment that looked functional but would fail under operation. Restoring production required skilled technicians that Japan did not have in sufficient numbers. The Netherlands and Britain had developed sophisticated petroleum engineering expertise over decades of operating these fields. The Japanese petroleum industry, by comparison, was tiny. Japan's domestic oil production from fields in Akita and Nagata totaled only about 3 million barrels annually. The entire Japanese petroleum engineering sector was perhaps 1/10 the size of what the Dutch and British had deployed in the East Indies. Most Dutch and British petroleum engineers had been evacuated before Japanese forces arrived. Those who remained and were captured were imprisoned rather than put to work. Using enemy nationals to operate critical war industries raised security concerns that Japanese military authorities could not overcome. Language barriers created complications. The Japanese military distrusted the loyalties of captured personnel. Japan had to send petroleum engineers from the home islands to operate the captured fields, but finding qualified people was difficult. Japanese universities had not trained petroleum engineers in large numbers because Japan had virtually no domestic oil industry. Mining engineers could be retrained for some tasks. Chemical engineers understood refinery processes. But the specialized knowledge required to operate tropical oil fields efficiently, to maintain production without damaging reservoirs, to solve problems that arose during operations, to restore production at damaged facilities. That knowledge was scarce in Japan. Equipment shortages proved even more problematic than personnel gaps. Oil field equipment is specialized, heavy, difficult to transport, and impossible to improvise. Drilling rigs weigh hundreds of tons and require specialized transportation vessels. Refinery components are precisely manufactured and cannot be easily replaced. Pumping equipment must match specific well characteristics. Pipelines must be properly sized and routed. Storage tanks must meet capacity requirements. Japan needed to ship replacement equipment from the home islands to the oil fields. But Japanese merchant shipping was already stretched thin under wartime demands. The same ships that needed to carry oil from the captured fields to Japan also needed to carry equipment to those fields. Ships traveling southbound carried drilling equipment, refinery components, pumping machinery. Ships traveling northbound carried crude oil and refined products. But there were never enough ships to do both adequately. Moreover, merchant ships were increasingly targeted by American submarines. Every ship sunk carrying equipment south meant production in the oil fields could not be restored. Every ship sunk carrying oil north meant less fuel reached Japan. Production in the captured territories struggled to reach pre-war levels. In 1940, before the Japanese invasion, the Dutch East Indies produced 65 million barrels. In 1942, after Japanese occupation, production reached only 25.9 million barrels, less than 40% of pre-war production, despite major efforts to restore facilities. The shortfall of nearly 40 million barrels represented oil that did not exist, that could not be captured, that could not help Japan win the war. Japanese planners had assumed they would quickly restore full production. They had assumed 65 million barrels per year would be available. They had based the entire war strategy on that assumption, but actual production was less than half that level. In 1943, production improved to 49.6 million barrels as restoration efforts continued and more facilities came back online. That was 76% of pre-war levels, a significant achievement that demonstrated Japanese technical competence. But by then, a new problem had become critical: the tanker shortage. The mathematics of the tanker problem were unforgiving. The distance from Borneo to Japan is approximately 2,000 nautical miles. From Sumatra, the distance is greater. A typical Japanese tanker in 1941 had a cargo capacity of about 10,000 tons dead weight, which translated to roughly 75,000 barrels of oil. At a cruising speed of 11 to 12 knots, economical for tanker operations, the round trip from Borneo to Japan took approximately 4 weeks, including loading and unloading time. That meant a single tanker could theoretically make about 13 trips per year, delivering approximately 975,000 barrels annually if it operated continuously without losses or major delays. To transport 49 million barrels annually, the amount the captured territories produced in 1943, Japan needed approximately 50 tankers in continuous operation dedicated solely to oil shipments from the Dutch East Indies. That number did not include tankers needed for moving oil between Japanese ports, tankers supporting naval operations at sea, tankers carrying aviation fuel, or tankers that would inevitably be damaged, under repair, or sunk. In December 1941, Japan possessed approximately 49 ocean-going tankers suitable for long-range oil transport, totaling about 500,000 gross tons. That number included both Navy tankers and civilian tankers requisitioned for military use. It was barely sufficient for peacetime needs when oil could be purchased from nearby sources and domestic production supplemented imports. For war with all oil coming from distant conquered territories, it was catastrophically inadequate. Building new tankers required shipyard capacity and construction time. A tanker took approximately 8 to 10 months to build from keel laying to delivery. But Japanese shipyards were already operating at maximum capacity building warships. Every month, shipyards were launching destroyers, submarines, cruisers, aircraft carriers. The Navy General Staff and the government prioritized combat vessels over support vessels. Tankers were unglamorous. They did not sink enemy ships. They did not win battles. They just carried oil. The priority always went to warships. Between December 1941 and December 1943, Japanese shipyards focused on warship construction. Some tankers were built, but not nearly enough to replace losses. Meanwhile, American submarines were systematically destroying Japan's tanker fleet in what became one of the most successful submarine campaigns in naval history. American submarines operated under a doctrine specifically targeting Japanese logistics. Tankers were priority targets. Every tanker sunk represented thousands of barrels of oil that would never reach Japan. Submarines lurked along tanker routes between the Dutch East Indies and Japan. They waited near choke points. Luzon Strait, the passage between the Philippines and Formosa, became known as a submarine killing ground. Tankers had to pass through to reach Japan from the south. Submarines waited there in ambush. The impact was devastating. Every tanker sunk meant less oil transported. But the effects cascaded beyond simple tonnage losses. Each tanker lost meant remaining tankers had to make more trips to transport the same amount of oil. More trips meant more time at sea. More time at sea meant more exposure to submarine attack. It created a death spiral where each loss made remaining tankers more vulnerable. Furthermore, tanker crews became increasingly demoralized as losses mounted. Sailing on a tanker became one of the most dangerous jobs in the Japanese merchant marine. Tankers were slow, poorly armed, often sailed with inadequate escorts because destroyers were needed for other purposes. Crews knew they were priority targets. The psychological toll affected operations even when tankers survived their voyages. Tanker captains began taking circuitous routes to avoid known submarine operating areas. Routes that should have taken 4 weeks began taking 5 or 6 weeks as captains zigzagged, hugged coastlines, waited in protected anchorages for escorts. Longer voyages meant fewer trips per year. Fewer trips meant less oil transported even by surviving tankers. The submarine threat reduced effective tanker capacity even beyond actual sinkings. By late 1942, the tanker shortage had become critical. Japanese oil imports began declining, not because production in the conquered territories was falling, but because the shipping to transport that oil was disappearing. Oil sat in storage tanks in Borneo and Sumatra with no ships available to move it. The submarine campaign had created a transportation choke point that strangled Japanese oil supplies. By April 1942, just 4 months after Pearl Harbor, the mathematical reality of Japan's fuel crisis was becoming undeniable. Japanese oil reserves had dropped from 50 million barrels in September 1941 to approximately 38 million barrels. The decline of 12 million barrels in 7 months represented a burn rate far exceeding peacetime projections. The Navy alone was consuming approximately 2.4 million barrels per month, significantly above planning estimates that had assumed 1.5 to 2 million barrels monthly. Admiral Yamamoto received detailed reports about the fuel situation in May 1942 as he prepared for the operation against Midway. The numbers were alarming. At current consumption rates, even with optimistic assumptions about oil production in captured territories and successful tanker voyages, Japan would exhaust its oil reserves sometime in 1943, possibly as early as mid-1943 if consumption remained at current levels or increased further. The Naval General Staff held a series of emergency meetings in Tokyo throughout the summer and fall of 1942 to discuss the fuel crisis. Minutes from these meetings reveal growing concern and increasingly desperate proposals. Every solution discussed had fundamental problems that made implementation difficult or impossible. One proposal was to dramatically increase tanker construction. Build 50 new tankers immediately. Double or triple transport capacity. But Japanese shipyards were already operating at maximum capacity around the clock. Building 50 tankers meant not building 50 destroyers, or 10 cruisers, or 2 aircraft carriers. Combat vessels were needed to fight the war. Choosing tankers over warships meant accepting reduced combat capability. Moreover, tankers took 8 to 10 months to build. Ships begun in late 1942 would not enter service until mid to late 1943 at the earliest. That might be too late if reserves were exhausted before the new tankers became available. Another proposal was to reduce operational tempo across all forces. Order all units to minimize fuel consumption. Reduce training flights. Limit naval exercises. Keep ships in port unless operationally necessary. But reducing operations meant ceding initiative to the Americans. It meant allowing enemy forces to advance without opposition. It meant watching American power grow while Japanese forces sat idle. Every week of reduced operations was a week the Americans used to build more ships, train more pilots, move closer to Japan. Trading fuel conservation for operational weakness was trading one form of defeat for another. A third proposal, which was actually implemented, was to move major fleet units closer to the oil source, base the battleships and large carriers at Singapore or in the waters around Borneo and the Dutch East Indies. Ships stationed near the oil fields could refuel directly without requiring tanker transport to Japan. This saved tanker capacity for other purposes and kept the fleet fueled. But stationing the fleet thousands of miles from Japan created its own problems. The decisive battles were happening in the Central Pacific, at Midway in June 1942, at Guadalcanal starting in August 1942, at Tarawa in November 1943, at the Marianas in June 1944. These battles were being fought 2,000 to 3,000 miles from Singapore. The ships that were supposed to defend Japan were sitting near Borneo because that was where the fuel was. By the time orders could be sent, fleets could sortie and ships could steam thousands of miles to the battle area. Engagements were often decided. The American advance continued while Japanese battleships sat idle near the oil fields. A fourth proposal was to use lower-grade fuels to conserve refined products. Tankers could carry unrefined Borneo crude directly to naval bases rather than carrying refined bunker fuel. Ships could burn the crude directly. This was actually attempted. Japanese warships in 1943 and 1944 increasingly burned unrefined crude oil as bunker fuel. The consequences were predictable. Crude oil contains sulfur, salt, sediments, and other contaminants that refined bunker fuel has removed. Burning crude caused rapid accumulation of deposits in boilers and fireboxes. Boiler tubes became clogged and less efficient. Heat transfer degraded. Ships burning crude developed maintenance problems at accelerated rates. Boiler cleaning, normally done every few months, had to be done every few weeks. Some ships suffered boiler failures, leaving them dead in the water, requiring tows to repair facilities. Using crude oil saved transportation capacity, but degraded fleet readiness and created long-term maintenance problems that compounded the fuel shortage. A fifth proposal was to develop synthetic fuel production in Japan and Manchuria. Germany had successfully developed synthetic fuel from coal. Japan could do the same. But synthetic fuel production required massive industrial investment, specialized equipment, and coal of specific quality. Building synthetic fuel plants took years. The technology was complex, and Japan lacked the expertise Germany had developed over 2 decades of research. Small-scale experiments were attempted, but never reached industrial production levels that could meaningfully offset the oil shortage. Synthetic fuel remained a theoretical solution that could not be implemented quickly enough to matter. By September 1942, Japanese consumption was averaging approximately 3.7 million barrels per month. While imports from captured territories were falling short of that level, the deficit came from strategic reserves. Every month, Japan's strategic stockpile shrank. The Navy estimated that at current trends, reserves would drop below 10 million barrels by mid-1943. Below 10 million, the Navy considered reserves inadequate for sustained operations. That was the crisis threshold. The fundamental problem was arithmetic that admitted no solution. Japan needed approximately 40 million barrels per year minimum to sustain military operations at the intensity required to fight the United States. After accounting for submarine losses and transportation inefficiencies, Japan could import at most 20 to 25 million barrels per year from captured territories. Domestic production added only 3 million barrels annually. Synthetic fuel contributed negligible amounts. There was a structural deficit of 12 to 17 million barrels per year. No combination of efficiency measures, operational restrictions, or technical adaptations could close a gap that large. The mathematics were inexorable. By mid-1943, Japanese oil reserves had dropped to approximately 15 million barrels, less than a third of pre-war levels. American submarines had devastated the tanker fleet. Ships that survived faced dangerous waters and took circuitous routes, burning much of their cargo as fuel for their own engines. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Japanese carriers operated at the extreme limit of their fuel range. They could not maneuver freely because every unnecessary mile consumed irreplaceable fuel. American carriers, by contrast, had virtually unlimited fuel. They were supported by a massive logistics train of fleet oilers that gave them complete operational freedom. The difference was not about courage or skill. It was not about superior training or tactical brilliance. It was about mathematics. America had the oil and the tankers to deliver it. Japan had neither. By late 1944, Japanese oil imports had collapsed almost completely. Most tankers had been sunk. The few that survived could barely operate. Many ships sat at anchor with empty fuel bunkers, unable to sortie even when ordered. The Japanese Navy, which had struck Pearl Harbor with overwhelming confidence, had become paralyzed by fuel exhaustion. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, Japanese forces made a desperate sortie that consumed most of their remaining fuel reserves. The operation was not designed as a one-way mission, but severe fuel shortages meant ships could barely return to port afterward. The fleet was effectively immobilized by fuel exhaustion. In April 1945, the battleship Yamato made her final sortie toward Okinawa. Operation Tango was explicitly designed as a suicide mission. Orders called for minimal fuel, just enough to reach Okinawa, where the ship would beach herself and fight as a stationary gun platform. Local base commanders at Tokuyama secretly provided more fuel than the bare minimum orders specified, approximately 60% of full capacity rather than just enough for a one-way trip. This act of defiance showed how controversial the suicide mission was, even within the Japanese Navy. But even 60% fuel was probably insufficient for a return voyage. Yamato was sunk by American aircraft on April 7, 1945. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered, oil reserves were effectively exhausted. The combined fleet was immobilized. Most major warships had been sunk, but those that survived sat in port with empty bunkers. The oil fields in the Dutch East Indies were still producing, but the oil sat in storage tanks in Borneo because there were no tankers left to transport it. Japan had fought the entire war under a fuel deficit it could never overcome. A deficit that existed before the war started. A deficit that was predictable and calculable from the mathematics of consumption versus supply. Admiral Yamamoto had understood this from the very beginning. His January 7, 1941 letter to Navy Minister Oikawa had stated the problem clearly. Japan could not win a prolonged war. The mathematics did not support victory. The industrial imbalance was too great. The oil deficit was too large. The calculations showed inevitable defeat if the war lasted more than 6 to 8 months. Yamamoto understood something else as well. The only possible scenario for Japanese victory was if the Americans would negotiate a settlement after initial defeats. But Yamamoto knew American history. He had studied American society. He understood that Americans, when they committed to war, typically fought until they achieved total victory. The notion that Americans would negotiate after Pearl Harbor contradicted everything Yamamoto knew about American character. Yamamoto never believed Pearl Harbor would achieve a decisive strategic result. He knew the mathematics did not support Japanese victory, but he also knew he could not publicly refuse to plan the operation. That would have been career suicide. So he planned Pearl Harbor to the best of his ability, knowing it would probably fail strategically, hoping desperately that somehow the Americans would react differently than history and mathematics suggested. Commander Minoru Genda also understood the fuel problem. As the principal aviation tactician for the operation, Genda had been forced to study fuel calculations. He had worked through the numbers. He knew Japan's consumption rates exceeded projections. He knew tanker capacity was inadequate. He knew the captured oil fields could not produce enough to meet demand. He knew the American submarine campaign would devastate tanker fleets. On the morning of December 7th, when Genda stood on Akagi's flight deck watching the second wave return, he understood all of this. He knew the fuel tanks had not been attacked. He knew they should have been attacked. He knew that leaving them intact was a tactical error that cost Japan months of operational advantage. But Genda also knew something else. Even if the fuel tanks had been destroyed, even if Pearl Harbor had been rendered completely useless, even if the American Pacific Fleet had been forced to withdraw to California, the mathematics still did not work. Japan still did not have enough oil to win. Fuel consumption rates were still too high. Tanker capacity was still too low. Captured oil fields could not produce enough to meet demand. Destroying Pearl Harbor's fuel tanks would have delayed American offensive operations by perhaps 6 to 12 months, but it would not have changed the outcome. The outcome was determined by mathematics that existed before the first bomb fell. The fundamental lesson was stark and undeniable. Industrial wars cannot be fought without industrial resources. Naval operations cannot be sustained without fuel. Arithmetic cannot be wished away because the numbers are politically inconvenient. The mathematics of Japan's fuel deficit admitted no solution. Japan needed approximately 40 million barrels of oil per year minimum. Japan had access to approximately 25 to 30 million barrels per year from all sources combined after accounting for transportation losses. The deficit was 10 to 15 million barrels per year. No amount of tactical brilliance, fighting spirit, or superior training could overcome a deficit of 10 to 15 million barrels per year. The fatal error that doomed Japan was not the tactical decision to focus on battleships instead of fuel tanks at Pearl Harbor. It was not the operational decision to withdraw after 2 waves instead of launching a third strike. The fatal error was going to war in the first place based on assumptions about fuel consumption, oil production, and tanker capacity that were demonstrably wrong. These assumptions had been made by planners who prioritized what leadership wanted to hear over what the mathematics actually said. Multiple officers in the Japanese Navy understood the resource constraints. They understood Japan lacked the oil to sustain a prolonged war. But institutional culture discouraged dissent. Officers who raised objections to approved plans were seen as lacking loyalty and fighting spirit. The path to career advancement was supporting leadership decisions, not questioning them. Speaking uncomfortable truths was career suicide. So the people who understood the mathematics stayed quiet. The people who did not understand the mathematics made the decisions, and Japan went to war with fuel consumption projections that underestimated actual requirements, oil production estimates that overestimated what captured fields could deliver, and tanker capacity calculations that ignored the inevitable losses to submarine warfare. Captain Kamito Kuroshima survived the war. Whether he was ever formally interviewed about his wartime planning work is unclear from available records. But the failure of Japanese strategic planning speaks for itself. The assumptions built into the war plan were wrong. The calculations were wrong. The consequences were catastrophic. Commander Minoru Genda also survived the war. He remained in military service after the Japanese surrender, eventually becoming Chief of Staff of Japan's Air Self-Defense Force. He served from 1959 to 1962. In interviews throughout his life, Genda consistently stated that even if the Pearl Harbor attack had been executed perfectly, even if every target had been destroyed, Japan still would have lost the war. The industrial and resource imbalance was simply too great to overcome. The mathematics admitted no possibility of victory. Admiral Yamamoto did not live to see Japan's defeat. He was killed on April 18, 1943, when American fighters intercepted his aircraft over Bougainville. American cryptographers had broken Japanese naval codes and learned his flight schedule. The mission to intercept him was personally approved by President Roosevelt. Yamamoto died knowing the fuel crisis was developing exactly as he had predicted. He died knowing that no amount of tactical victories could overcome the mathematical realities of oil consumption versus supply. The broader lesson extended far beyond World War II or naval operations. The story of Japan's fatal miscalculation was ultimately about institutional culture, about political pressures that override rational analysis, about officers who knew uncomfortable truths but stayed silent, about leaders who chose to believe what they wanted to believe, rather than what the numbers actually said. Wars are not won by courage alone. They are not won by superior tactics or better training or fighting spirit. Wars are won by logistics, by industrial capacity, by resources, by the unglamorous mathematics of how much fuel you have versus how much fuel you need. Japan needed 40 million barrels per year. Japan had 25 million barrels per year. The war was lost in that arithmetic. Everything else, all the battles and all the sacrifice and all the tactical brilliance, was just the working out of mathematical inevitability. When nations ignore mathematics because it contradicts political goals, when institutions suppress analysis because it challenges approved strategies, when leaders choose comfortable falsehoods over uncomfortable facts, the result is not just defeat, it is catastrophe. The fuel tanks at Pearl Harbor remained untouched that December morning because Japan's leadership could not accept what the mathematics actually said. The tanks would have represented the answer they did not want to hear, that Japan could not win a prolonged war regardless of initial tactical success, that the mathematics of industrial capacity made Japanese victory impossible, that the only honest assessment was pessimistic and therefore politically unacceptable. So the tanks were left in the target priority below battleships. The mathematics were left in confidential staff meetings where they could not challenge approved strategy. The officers who understood the numbers were left silent by institutional pressure. And Japan went to war knowing, at some level, that the arithmetic did not support victory. The Pacific War lasted 3 years and 8 months, not the 6 to 8 months Japanese planners had optimistically projected. Japan consumed approximately 150 million barrels of fuel over the war's duration. Japan had available, from all sources, accounting for all losses, approximately 80 million barrels. The structural deficit was 70 million barrels. 70 million barrels that did not exist, that could not be captured, that could not be shipped, that could not save Japan. The difference between what Japan needed and what Japan possessed was written in the wreckage of ships that sat idle with empty fuel bunkers. It was written in tanker losses to American submarines. It was written in oil fields that could not be fully restored. It was written in the graves of 2.5 million Japanese military personnel and over 1 million Japanese civilians who died in a war the mathematics said Japan could not win. The most profound tragedy is not that Japan lost the war. Nations lose wars. The most profound tragedy is that Japan's defeat was written in mathematics that existed before the first shot was fired, that could have been calculated months before Pearl Harbor, that could have prevented the entire catastrophe if leadership had been willing to listen to uncomfortable truth instead of choosing comfortable illusion.